India and the US were expected to finalize an interim trade agreement before July 24, 2026. But that deadline has now passed and there is still no deal. What happens next could be crucial for India-US trade relations. The July 24 deadline was linked to a 150-day period that began after the US Supreme Court struck down tariffs imposed by President Donald Trump on Feb 20, 2026. Following that ruling, the US administration introduced temporary 10% tariffs on imports from countries around the world for 150 days, and that day ended on July 24, 2026. India and the US had been working towards completing their interim trade agreement before that period ended. But one day after the deadline passed, India's Commerce and Industry Minister Piyush Goyal made India's position clear. He said New Delhi would not sign the proposed bilateral trade agreement with Washington unless a framework was finalized that gave Indian exports a comparative tariff advantage over competing countries. And now, with the deadline behind us and the trade agreement still unsigned, there are growing concerns that Washington could use other economic and policy tools to put pressure on New Delhi. So what are these pressure points? Let's begin with the most obvious one, tariffs. The US Senate has advanced a long-pending bipartisan bill that could significantly increase pressure on countries continuing to purchase Russian energy. The legislation seeks to impose additional restrictions on major buyers of Russian oil and natural gas and also processes extending sanctions against Iran. The bill was championed by late Senator Lindsey Graham. If it becomes law, US President Trump could be given the authority to impose tariffs of up to 100% on goods imported from the world's biggest purchasers of Russian oil and gas, including India and China. The measures received overwhelming support in the Senate, passing by a vote of 86 to 12. Almost all Republicans and a majority of Democrats supported it, allowing it to cross the crucial 60-vote threshold. So what exactly does this bill propose? The legislation would impose sanctions on Russian officials, oligarchs, and financial institutions. It would also target what is known as Russia's shadow fleet, a network of vessels allegedly used to circumvent restrictions on Moscow's oil exports. More importantly for India, the bill would give President Trump the power to impose tariffs of as much as 100% on goods from major buyers of Russian oil and gas. However, the legislation does contain certain exceptions. Countries that import less than 15% of their natural gas from Russia and are taking steps to reduce those imports could qualify for exemptions. The bill also expands existing sanctions powers aimed at restricting funding for Iran's energy and weapons sectors. These provisions were added at the request of President Trump. Supporters of the legislation argue that the goal is to cut off Moscow's energy revenues and weaken Russian President Vladimir Putin's ability to finance the war in Ukraine, which has now entered its 5th year. But the bill is not without opposition. While there is broad support in Washington for punishing Russia, some Democrats have raised concerns about the tariff provisions. They argue that the legislation could give President Trump excessive authority over tariffs, potentially increase costs for American consumers, and even hurt US allies in Europe. The legislation still has several hurdles to clear. It must complete the Senate process and then receive approval for the House of Representatives before it can reach the President's desk. The House, however, has already left Washington for its summer recess and is unlikely to take up the bill before September. But if this legislation eventually becomes law, India would find itself facing another layer of economic pressure from Washington, particularly because of its continued energy relationship with Russia. And on the day the deadline for concluding the proposed interim trade agreement expired, that is July 24, 2026, the US Trade Representative had announced an additional 10% tariff on import from India and several other countries over concerns about goods produced using forced labor. The permanent duty imposed following a Section 301 investigation was largely expected and will replace the existing temporary 10% tariff. The move is unlikely to have a major impact on India. However, despite the new tariffs being lower than the proposed 12.5% levy on India, the country's exports face another potential setback as the US conducts a separate investigation into more than a dozen countries over alleged structural overcapacity. India had challenged the probe, maintaining that unilateral action was unwarranted and that it already had regulations in place to prevent forced labor. Meanwhile, the investigation was still underway. The Directorate General of Foreign Trade amended its rules to align with International Labour Organization's definition of forced labor and introduced provisions for investigation under the Foreign Trade Policy. The US STR has taken these changes into account while determining the new tariffs. The tariffs are not the only issue. Pressure point 2. The possible $100,000 OPT fee. The second potential pressure tactic involves something that directly affects international students, particularly thousands of Indians studying in the United States. This is the proposed $100,000 fee for international students seeking to work in America after completing their education. To understand the significance of this proposal, we first need to understand what OPT is. OPT stands for Optional Practical Training. It is a temporary work authorization available to eligible international students studying in the US on an F1 student visa. OPT allows students to gain practical work experience in America that is directly connected to their field of study after completing their degree. For years, OPT has been one of the biggest attractions for international students considering American universities. International students who qualify can generally work in US for up to 12 months after completing a bachelor's, master's or doctoral degree. Now, if the proposed $100,000 fee becomes a reality, who would be affected? Primarily, international students graduating from American universities on F1 visas, students applying for post-study work authorization through OPT, and STEM graduates seeking the additional 24-month extension. Indian students could be among those most affected. India is now the largest source of international students in the US, and a significant number of Indian students pursue STEM-related courses, making them eligible for the longer OPT period. For many Indian students, the possibility of working in the US after graduation is a major factor in choosing an American university in the first place. A $100,000 fee could therefore make the overall cost of studying in the US substantially higher and could influence future decisions about where students choose to pursue higher education. According to the report by Wall Street Journal, the Trump administration is considering such a fee for graduates seeking to work through OPT as part of a broader overhaul of the student visa system. However, there is an important caveat. The $100,000 fee is not currently in effect. The proposal is still under consideration and has not been officially announced or implemented. It is also not clear who would ultimately be responsible for paying such a fee, the student, the employer, or the university. There are also no final details regarding eligibility, exemptions, or when such a policy could potentially come into force. But even the possibility of such a measure has raised concerns because it could make American higher education considerably less attractive for students, especially those who depend on post-study employment to help recover the high cost of tuition. And then comes the third pressure point: sanctions on Indian companies. The United States has also sanctioned 6 entities and individuals, including an Indian-based company, over alleged support for Iran's Mahan Air. The US government claims Mahan Air has helped sustain what Washington describes as a terrorist enterprise linked to Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or the IRGC. The US Department of Treasury announced the sanctions on Thursday, saying they targeted companies that operate as general sales agents for Mahan Air. US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said that companies providing financial services, logistics, or commercial support to the IRGC or Mahan Air were helping sustain what Washington considers a terrorist enterprise. Bessent also said that the Treasury Department would continue to identify such entities, exposing them and cutting them off from the American financial system. According to US Secretary, Mahan Air presents itself as a civilian airline but has allegedly provided long-standing support to the IRGC. Washington claims the airline has transported IRGC Quds Force personnel, facilitated military training and assisted in moving unmanned aerial vehicle system and weapons. Among the entities sanctioned is Skis Travels and Logistics Private Limited, an India-based company with offices in Srinagar and Delhi. According to the information on its website, the company began representing Mahan Airways as its general sales agent in 2020. The US Treasury also named 3 other Mahan Air general sales agents. These include China's Shanghai Wings International Logistics Company, which Washington says coordinated the transportation of electronics from China to Iran, Russia-based Air Cargo Pro Limited, and Shanghai Elite International Travel Company. To conclude, so where does all this leave India and the United States? The interim trade deal that was expected to be finalized before July 24 is still pending. At the same time, India is facing the possibility of higher tariffs over its continued purchases of Russian energy. Indian students could potentially face a major financial hurdle if the proposed $100,000 OPT fee becomes a policy. And an Indian-based company has already been included in the latest round of US sanctions targeting entities allegedly connected to Iran's Mahan Air, and all these developments took place after the deadline expired. The question therefore is whether these developments are simply separate policy decisions being taken by Washington, or whether they collectively signal a broader attempt to increase pressure on New Delhi as two sides negotiate the trade agreement. One thing, however, is becoming increasingly clear. The July 24 deadline has passed, the trade deal remains unsigned, and the negotiations are entering a more complicated phase. And if an agreement is not reached soon, New Delhi may have to brace itself for considerably more pressure from Washington. That's all for today's World Report. Till I see you next time with another topic in hand. Thanks for watching.